We now want to look at one of the most indelible and famous of all American short stories, Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne, a story that's often characterized as a moral allegory, meaning abstract meaning comes through the story and emerges through the fictional characters who serve as symbols for higher moral truths. This is the territory Hawthorne is so famous for and works so well with, and succeeds in this tale particularly. The allegory in Young Goodman Brown is one based on an archetypal journey. It's an initiation story of an everyman character who goes from innocence to experience, from faith to loss of faith. And the name Goodman was common and nearly universal, comparable to Mr. today, but it's also indicative in this allegory of a good man who, in this story, encounters evil. The roots of Hawthorne's story go back to allegorical morality plays, such as the 15th century English Everyman or John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, which appeared in 1678. Goodman Brown's wife, Faith, is left behind after keeping Goodman back a while and leaving him thinking, after this one night, that he will cling to her skirts and follow her to heaven. The story then plunges Goodman Brown into a primeval forest on an errand or mission, a journey, the purpose of which is never made clear. Brown meets a man with a staff which bears a likeness to a great black snake, and the man turns out to be the devil, who tells Brown, contrary to Brown's belief in his lineage, which he believes is from honest men who were good Christians, that Brown's ancestors were complicitous in the lashing of a Quaker woman through the streets of Salem and the setting of fire to an Indian village. Hawthorne was born in the infamous Salem, Massachusetts, and descended from ancestors who actually participated in the Salem witch trials and who believed in a stern form of Puritanism tied to the teachings of John Calvin. Hawthorne's ancestor was William Hawthorne, a colonial magistrate who persecuted Quakers, and William Hawthorne's son John was a Puritan investigator of those accused of witchcraft. Young Goodman Brown is often read as a personal story of Hawthorne's rendering of his own ancestral heritage and the sense of guilt he felt about it. But before we venture further into Hawthorne's life or to a greater understanding of Calvinism, let us go back into the forest and discuss the essence of what occurs in this strangely mesmerizing and powerful horror story of moral guilt and good and evil. The devil informs Brown that he, Satan, has had close connections with some of the most outwardly moral and exemplary and upstanding citizens. And this is soon borne out by the appearance of the woman who taught Brown his catechisms as a youth, as well as by the presence in the forest of the town deacon and minister. What can these religious figures be doing in the woods in the darkness of night? Well, having, it turns out, a black Sabbath, a communion with the devil, whom Goodman Brown believes he can resist and stand firm against, quote, with heaven above and faith below, end quote. But it turns out that Faith, like all of the townspeople of Salem, both religious and irreligious, the powerful and the pariah, are of one assembly with the devil. So you can get used to Hawthorne's prose style here. It goes back to the proverbial Puritan. "My faith is gone," cried he after one stupefied moment. "There is no good on earth, and sin is but a name. Come, devil, for thee is this world given." And maddened with despair, so that he laughed loud and long, did Goodman Brown grasp his staff and set forth again, at such a rate that he seemed to fly along the forest path rather than to walk or to run. The road grew wilder and drearier and more faintly traced, and vanished at length, leaving him in the heart of the dark wilderness, still rushing onward with the instinct that guides mortal man to evil. Let me stop there because that really sums up much of the theology of Hawthorne and the Puritans. There's an instinctual nature, an innate nature that drives men and women, to evil. The whole forest was peopled with frightful sounds, the creaking of the trees, the howling of wild beasts, and the yell of Indians, while sometimes the wind tolled like a distant church bell, and sometimes gave a broad roar around the traveler as if all nature were laughing him to scorn. But he was himself the chief horror of the scene and shrank not from its other horrors. In other words, what's in the mortal heart, this evil that we carry around in us in a demonic way, is even far more evil, perhaps, as Hawthorne saw things and as he portrays things here, than the devil and what the devil can wreak. "Ha, ha, ha," roared Goodman Brown when the wind laughed at him. "Let us hear which will laugh loudest. Think not to frighten me with your deviltry. Come witch, come wizard, come Indian powwow, come devil himself, and here comes Goodman Brown. You may as well fear him as he fear you." In truth, all through the haunted forest there could be nothing more frightful than the figure of Goodman Brown. On he flew, among the black pines, brandishing his staff with frenzied gestures, now giving vent to an inspiration of horrid blasphemy, and now shouting forth such laughter as set all the echoes of the forest laughing like demons around him. The fiend in his own shape is less hideous than when he rages in the breast of man. And there it is, explicitly delivered to us by Hawthorne. Thus sped the demonic on his course until, quivering among the trees, he saw a red light before him, as when the felled trunks and branches of a clearing have been set on fire and throw up their lurid blaze against the sky at the hour of midnight. So we're at the witch's hour here, literally. And he paused in a lull of the tempest that had driven him onward and heard the swell of what seemed a hymn rolling solemnly from a distance with the weight of many voices. He knew the tune. It was a familiar one in the choir of the village meeting house. The verse died heavily away and was lengthened by a chorus, not of human voices, but of all the sounds of the benighted wilderness pealing in awful harmony together. Goodman Brown cried out, and his cry was lost to his own ear by its unison with the cry of the desert. In the interval of silence, he stole forward until the light glared full upon his eyes. At one extremity of an open space, hemmed in by the dark wall of the forest, arose a rock, bearing some rude natural resemblance either to an altar or a pulpit, and surrounded by 4 blazing pines, their tops aflame, their stems untouched, like candles at an evening meeting. The mass of foliage that had overgrown the summit of the rock was all on fire, blazing high into the night and fitfully illuminating the whole field. Even pendant twig and leafy festoon was in a blaze. As the red light arose and fell, a numerous congregation alternately shone forth, then disappeared in the shadow, and again grew, as it were, out of the darkness, peopling the heart of the solitary woods at once. Well, as the story moves us once again out of the forest and back into the town of Salem, Goodman Brown is a changed, a marked man for life. A mysterious transformation has occurred as a result of his nighttime journey, what's often called, attributed originally to St. John of the Cross, but really more aligned with the French philosopher Blaise Pascal, nearly 2 centuries before, the dark night of the soul. This is indeed exactly that for Goodman Brown. And Goodman Brown, as a result, becomes a man of gloom, cast for the rest of his life into the dark by an encounter with evil that could well have been nothing more than a vivid and disturbing dream. Hawthorne leaves the answer to whether Brown indeed was dreaming or not ambiguous. Well, now that we have essentially the outline of the story and a feel for Hawthorne's prose, let's talk once more of Calvinism and Puritanism. Calvinism, the religion of the Puritans, is a belief in the doctrine of original sin tied to predestination and associated with such stern figures as famed Puritan writer Jonathan Edwards, whose notion was all of mankind being sinners in the hands of an angry God. Puritanism is often associated with harshness and the punitive, with sexual repression and hard work and draconic codes of conduct placed on men and women before they leave this vale of tears, as Shelley called it. But the cornerstone of belief is in God's omnipotence and his knowing who is to be saved and who is to be damned, and of all of humankind being marked with the original sin of Adam that led to the fall. Hawthorne was consumed with an obsessiveness about Puritanism and about his own Puritan ancestors. He wrote of them in a work of his called The Custom House, which is often considered an introduction to the Scarlet Letter. And it seems clear that his guilt about the sins of the fathers and his own need to exorcise that guilt is part of the genius behind young Goodman Brown. Is Hawthorne being too allegorical, as both Poe and Henry James suggested? When you call a character Faith and make her the wife of a good man who goes out on a journey to confront evil, and you move your reader into a world of deviltry that mirrors humanity, perhaps one can say Hawthorne has gone a bit to too much trouble to spell out his moral terrain. But the story, whether too allegorical or not, compels us into what Melville aptly described in an admiring essay he wrote about Hawthorne as, quote, the great power of blackness. Hawthorne transports us into the dark part of the human mind, the part that wrestles with notions of human depravity and original sin. Goodman Brown and Faith have been married for 3 months, 1 trimester, when the story begins. And the newness of their marital union suggests the ties between original sin and human sexuality. The Puritan belief in witches is seen in the story in the mention by one of its characters, Goody Cloyes, that's Brown's catechism teacher, of her broomstick being lost or stolen, perhaps by an unhanged witch, and talk of magic potions of cinquefoil and wolfbane and, quote, the fine wheat and fat of a newborn babe, end of quote. The Puritans feared and actually persecuted the Indians, whom they viewed as godless and wild pagans who were residing in the woods, and did reside in the woods. And that's, of course, the central allegorical setting for paganism. It's a place where Hawthorne tells us there is no church. There's talk of powwows in the woods, and pre-industrial America often associated woods or forests with lawlessness, as well as with Indians, who were viewed as being part of that pagan lawlessness. In Hawthorne's great classic novel, The Scarlet Letter, the act of sexual union between Hester Prynne and Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale was likely to have occurred in the forest, where later on in the novel we see Hester take off her scarlet letter, the mark of her adulterous sin, in part because the forest is free and lawless. Of course, D.H. Lawrence had a point worth considering when he suggested that imagining sexual intercourse of any kind involving the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale is not an easy task. The important point here is that in young Goodman Brown and in The Scarlet Letter, the forest is a place apart from the rules of faith and moral conduct, a place of anarchic freedom and the transparency of sin. Before we discuss the story Young Goodman Brown and its effect and meaning and value, let's find out a bit more about Hawthorne's life and who he was. Hawthorne's father died in 1808 when the author was only 4 years old, and his mother became a recluse. Hawthorne would also live an isolated life of seclusion and isolation, which shaped both his character and his vision, though all of that would change and he would wind up a famous and prosperous man. He was an editor and a novelist as well as a short story writer, and he also wrote children's stories, travel sketches, and Gothic tales, and a children's history of the world that sold over 1 million copies but made him all of $100, the fee paid to him for the book. Later on, success would eventually come to Hawthorne, and he wound up in a relatively high diplomatic position. He was a college classmate and close friend of America's 14th president, Franklin Pierce. And in fact, Hawthorne wrote a presidential campaign biography for Pierce and was appointed by Pierce to Liverpool as U.S. consul. Hawthorne published his first tale in 1830, and 5 years later, he published Young Goodman Brown in an issue of New England magazine. The story later appeared in a short story collection of Hawthorne's called Mosses from an Old Manse. Let's talk about the story in terms of its meaning, interpret it to some extent, and its effect. It's really another horror story with the New England or Boston setting, steeped in Puritan folklore and theology, by contrast to Poe's Southern-nurtured Gothicism and European set tale. The horror in this story is, of course, in the meeting with the devil, but it's also in seeing people beneath their masks and everyday appearances, including those of piety and religiosity. But perhaps the most profound horror, as I've indicated, is in Goodman Brown himself, his loss of faith, his realization of the demonic force that is within himself. Implicit in the story is the moral suasion of the depravity of human nature and the evil that resides in the human heart. The fact that Brown's conversion, after he witnesses the Black Mass in the forest, is a chilling one, and one which Hawthorne saw as baleful, really comes upon us in reading this story. And I use the word chilling because we think of Hawthorne's Roger Chillingworth, the cuckolded husband in The Scarlet Letter, who allowed his intellect to encase his heart in a desire for revenge against the adulterer, the cuckolder, the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale. Goodman Brown's heart becomes increasingly encased by his sense of gloom from having seen this Black Sabbath communion that involved all of the righteous and high-bred folk of Salem, as well as his wife Faith. The loss of faith for Hawthorne was a great horror. "Faith, Faith," cried the husband, "look up to heaven and resist the wicked one." This is Goodman Brown seeing his wife at this Black Mass and telling her to resist the devil. Whether Faith obeyed, he knew not. Hardly had he spoken when he found himself amid calm night and solitude, listening to a roar of the wind which died heavily away through the forest. He staggered against the rock and felt it chill and damp, while a hanging twig that had been all on fire besprinkled his cheek with the coldest dew. The next morning, young Goodman Brown came slowly into the street of Salem Village, staring around him like a bewildered man. The good old minister was taking a walk along the graveyard to get an appetite for breakfast and meditate his sermon, and bestowed a blessing as he passed on Goodman Brown. He shrank from the venerable saint as if to avoid an anathema. Old Deacon Goodman was at domestic worship, and the holy words of his prayer were heard throughout the open window. "What God doth the wizard pray to?" quoth Goodman Brown. Goody Cloyes, that excellent old Christian, stood in the early sunshine at her own lattice, catechizing a little girl who had brought her a pint of morning's milk. Goodman Brown snatched away the child as from the grasp of the fiend himself. Turning the corner by the meeting house, he spied the head of Faith with the pink ribbons, gazing anxiously forth and bursting into such joy at sight of him that she skipped along the street and almost kissed her husband before the whole village. But Goodman Brown looked sternly and sadly into her face and passed on without a greeting. You can see the effect that this night in the forest, this covenant with the devil, had on him. When he left his wife behind, and now he has gone and sees his wife greeting him with joy, and he can't even really abide her. Had Goodman Brown fallen asleep in the forest and only dreamed a wild dream of a witch meeting? Be it so if you will, but alas, it was a dream of evil omen. For young Goodman Brown, a stern, a sad, a darkly meditative, a distrustful, if not a desperate man, did he become from the night of that fearful dream. On the Sabbath day, when the congregation were singing a holy psalm, he could not listen because an anthem of sin rushed loudly upon his ear and drowned all the blessed strain. When the minister spoke from the pulpit with power and fervid eloquence, and with his hand on the open Bible, of the sacred truths of our religion, and of saint-like lives and triumphant deaths, and of future bliss or misery unutterable, then did Goodman Brown turn pale, dreading lest the roof should thunder down upon the gray blasphemer and his hearers. Often, awaking suddenly at midnight, he shrank from the bosom of faith, and at morning or eventide, when the family knelt down at prayer, he scowled and muttered to himself, and gazed sternly at his wife, and turned away. And when he had lived long and was borne to his grave a hoary corpse, followed by Faith, an aged woman, and children and grandchildren, a goodly procession, besides neighbors not a few, they carved no hopeful verse upon his tombstone, for his dying hour was gloom. Well, you're certainly left with a sense of the onerousness, the heavy burden that this man carries with him from this one experience. Life can be like that, by the way. I mean, people do have those kind of experiences that turn them around and turn them into gloom, or just the opposite, certainly. One could argue into euphoria as well. But for Goodman Brown, we don't know why he went into the forest, but when he comes out and we experience what he experienced in the forest, he's a changed man. And as a changed man, his life is gloom. Now, this didn't stop him from procreating, having children and grandchildren, as we find out. But nevertheless, it's a sense of not desperation exactly, but, well, what Hawthorne called it, gloom that carries with him through the rest of his life. What happens to Brown is what Shakespeare and Hamlet called the pale cast of thought, a descent into darkness that results from intellect. Brown really can't be relieved of the effects of what he believed he saw in the forest scene, the black mass and communion feeling, and communion featuring the once angelic sable form of the devil, and the panoply of humankind, both good and bad. What is significant is that the story is spun to us in a realistic way despite its supernatural elements, and is made to include a strong didactic element, that is, a sense of teaching us about sin. You can see where Hawthorne was really, well, perhaps confused. The great Nobel laureate William Faulkner said, "Great literature is created when the heart is against itself." Faulkner had this Puritan heritage, he felt it intensely, and yet at the same time, in many ways, he wanted to relieve himself of it. He wanted to perhaps point out just how onerous and how burdensome and how much of, I'll call it a curse it could be. The story is fraught with ambiguity, and that contributes, I think, to its richness, maybe to its greatness. It's unclear at one point if Brown is seeing church members or being bedazzled by gleams of light flashing. It's unclear, though Hawthorne tells us some affirm, if the lady of the governor was there in the forest scene. It's also unclear, like with J.R. in the TV show Dallas, if you remember that, if all was a dream or why Brown needed to set out on his winter solstice journey in the first place. It's become almost trite to think of stories that are built on the pattern of a dream and that we don't know whether in ending the story it was supposed to be a dream or not, but Hawthorne was creating that ambiguity intentionally, I think, trying to give us a sense of just a dreamscape and the ambiguity of what can be imagined as opposed to what indeed may have been real. There are other, by the way, popular culture ties to young Goodman Brown, besides Dallas. There's the film The Blair Witch Project, which makes us think, I think, of the story Young Goodman Brown. There's Rosemary's Baby. Of course, stories about human encounters with the devil go back to the Bible, and from Faust up through The Exorcist and many modern tales. Brown had this covenant with the devil. That's what he discovered in the communion of his race. And that communion really represents an inability of humans, to borrow a bit from Jesus in the New Testament, to put Satan behind them. Not only couldn't he put Satan behind him, but Satan became ubiquitous in his life after he had been in the forest. And as we saw in the passage I read, he couldn't even look at those people who were giving blessings, who were trying to do God's work, with any kind of a serious countenance anymore. He took them to be doing the work of the devil because they were tainted in his mind by their association and communion with the devil. And this dreamlike quality in the story is really a precursor to the surreal, because it brings a reader's unconscious directly into play. We have all these Freudian approaches to dreamlike states, Freud telling us that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, but we have literary critics like Lionel Trilling who say that you really need to put an author on the couch as much as you can. It's not only the associations in the story that are with the unconscious and dreamlike, but it's also the associations that we might find out are tied to the writer, or how they are tied to the writer. That's essentially how you would work psychoanalytically with a story like Young Goodman Brown. What's important to remember here, however, is there's a division in the story, a psychological division. The woods are id-like, unconscious. There's qualities of the mind and the whole world of Boston that represents the outer conscious self. In this way, Young Goodman Brown is kind of a harbinger, really, to Freud's famous work in the later part of his career, Civilization and Its Discontents, which one of my friends used to call Civilization and Its Discotheques. But that's a work that's really much more anthropological. The view is that civilization is driven and ultimately built by the id, by unfettered drives that are compensated for by the guilt of conscience, or what Freud called the superego. There's a multivalent message in Young Goodman Brown that shows really the thin membrane separates good from evil. Also makes us wonder if Hawthorne is indicting the Puritans or in some way implicitly affirming what they believe. One can't help but come away from reading Young Goodman Brown, it seems to me, wondering about questions of faith, original sin, and the human propensity for evil. What other elements really make this story a masterpiece, have given it its longevity and its status as a masterpiece? Well, the central theme in this work is what Hawthorne saw as the unpardonable sin of divorcing the intellect from the heart. Whether Goodman Brown experienced what he experienced in the woods or actually dreamt it, nevertheless, when he came out, his intellect seemed to take over. And that intellect taking over diminishes love or reverence for the human soul. We saw this particularly in the character of Roger Chillingsworth in The Scarlet Letter. But it seems to me we see it ultimately also in Goodman Brown. And by the way, this is a story which, right from the opening paragraph, sets the mood and the tone, and both are masterfully sustained. Let me just give you an example of how that works. Young Goodman Brown came forth at sunset into the street at Salem Village, but put his head back after crossing the threshold to exchange a parting kiss with his young wife. And Faith, as the wife was aptly named, thrust her own pretty head into the street, letting the wind play with the pink ribbons of her cap while she called to Young Goodman Brown. Now notice how well structured the story is. From the beginning of the story, he gets a kiss from his wife. At the end, you remember, he avoids that kiss. The pink ribbons, which are introduced in the beginning of the story, are reintroduced at the end of the story. So there's a wonderful symmetry to the story. It's well structured. But there's also that sense initially of a kind of foreboding, of a mood that's cast early on in that first paragraph. His wife is asking him, don't stay too long. She's not questioning why he's going in there, but she wants to know that he'll return and that things will go all right and that they'll have the life that they'd had up until the time when he felt, for whatever reason, compelled to go into the woods and to enter into this dark sphere. The language is really rich. It's sometimes prosaic, but it's nevertheless Puritan speech that we hear as vernacular. And there are combined elements in this story of realism and surrealism tied to this evocation of the unconscious, and fabulism, that is, fable-like effects, within the allegorical frame that move us from out of the forest or woods to inside the forest and then once again outside to the town. The story represents a spectacular, life-transformative journey into what Joseph Conrad many years later would call the heart of darkness. And there is, make no mistake about it, a mesmerizing effect on readers as we become increasingly drawn into a world of fear and horror and loss of faith and see and feel the palpable evil of humanity and the evil communion of the human race. This story, I believe, ultimately compels us to reckon with larger questions of how we choose to live our lives. For Goodman Brown is left hopeless and in gloom at the end. Here's a story that combines galvanizing and frightening effects with this great allegorical ambiguity, didacticism, teaching us, even though Hawthorne really may have had his own ambiguous sense of what was to be taught, but certainly providing a kind of moral compass for a rich harvest of great and rewarding reading. I strongly urge more Hawthorne, the novels as well as other masterful short stories like The Birthmark, the story of Elmer the scientist who thinks his wife is perfect, but then again intellect takes over because she has a birthmark and he wants to remove it, and you know what that leads to. Never tinker with Mother Nature. And his story of sinister and gloomy guilt, The Minister's Black Veil. One can understand the nature of Hawthorne's truly extraordinary and riveting gifts as a storyteller by, of course, reading other works of his, including his novels, such as The Scarlet Letter and The Blithedale Romance. And one can understand more completely the thrust of the story's development in the 19th century by reading the stories of Herman Melville, whom I said was a great admirer of Hawthorne's, and who also, in his stories that are selected from the Encantadas, that's a collection, Bartleby the Scrivener and Billy Budd, takes us into deep psychological territory as well. But Hawthorne is the father of this deeply psychological storytelling. It extends into the present century. Stories like The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, or stories by the ever-prolific Joyce Carol Oates. And we're going to follow this path that Hawthorne provided in Young Goodman Brown as we head in our next lecture to Russia and another famous and seminal story by the Russian master Nikolai Gogol. Like Poe, Gogol was born, coincidentally enough, in 1809, 5 years after Hawthorne, and was a seminal figure in the production of the short story Far Away on Another Continent in Russia, where it also came into prominence and flourished. Gogol's story is another tale cast in realism, but with strong elements of satire and, at story's end, the haunting presence of one of the original little men of fiction, a man of seeming no consequence who wants nothing more in life than a better overcoat to have against the freezing cold of St. Petersburg. Next, one of Russia's most famous and revered short stories, Nikolai Gogol's The Overcoat.